The limousine pulled up to the cathedral just as the organ began to play, and Isabella Chen-Morrison stepped out in designer black, 5 identical faces peering through tinted windows, the children Richard never knew existed, arriving to witness their father marry another woman. But this story began 3 years earlier, in 2 very different rooms, with 2 very different kinds of waiting. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Evergreen Gracie Stories. I have missed you all. Thank you so for sticking around with me. I truly appreciate your love and support. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Isabella sat in the fertility clinic's sterile waiting room, her hands trembling as she clutched the appointment reminder. The letter felt like lead in her purse, the one she'd been too afraid to open for 2 weeks. Dr. Martinez had been cryptic on the phone, asking her to come in to discuss the results of her recent tests. At 34, after 5 years of trying, she'd begun to accept that children might not be part of her story. The irony wasn't lost on her. Richard had been pushing for these tests, desperate for an heir to his tech empire. But now, sitting here alone while he was away on business, a phrase that had become code for his increasingly frequent disappearances, she wondered if she even wanted to bring a child into their crumbling marriage. "Mrs. Morrison?" The nurse's voice cut through her spurling thoughts. Isabella followed her down the hallway, past photos of smiling families that felt like mockery. Dr. Martinez looked up from her chart with an expression Isabella couldn't read. "Isabella, I have some rather extraordinary news." Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the penthouse of Morrison Technologies, Richard paced his corner office like a caged animal. His phone buzzed with another text from Karina, the Jamaican model he'd met at a tech conference in Kingston 6 months ago. Her photo filled his screen, all curves and confidence, everything Isabella wasn't anymore. "When you leaving her, baby?" "I'm getting tired of hiding." Richard looked out at the city sprawling below him. 20 years of marriage to Isabella had given him stability, had helped him build his empire. She'd been the perfect corporate wife, elegant, supportive, never demanding too much attention. But somewhere along the way, perfect had become ordinary, predictable. Karina was fire. She was adventure. She was everything his carefully controlled life wasn't. His divorce lawyer had made it clear, with a prenup and no children, Isabella would walk away comfortable but not wealthy. It was clean, simple. And if the fertility test came back negative again, well, that just made his decision easier. He typed back, "Soon, very soon." Back at the clinic, Isabella stared at Dr. Martinez in stunned silence. "I'm sorry, did you say 5 quintuplets? It's extraordinarily rare. About 1 in 55 million pregnancies occur naturally. The hormone treatments we discussed last month seem to have been quite effective." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. 5 babies. 5 little hearts beating inside her. 5 reasons why her marriage to Richard suddenly felt more complicated than she'd ever imagined. "Does my husband know?" "Not unless you've told him. Patient confidentiality means—" "No." Isabella's voice was stronger than she felt. "He doesn't know, and I need time to process this before I tell him." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, concern creasing her features. "Isabella, this will be a high-risk pregnancy. You'll need support, family involvement. Have you and Richard discussed how you'd handle multiples?" A bitter laugh escaped Isabella's lips. Richard couldn't handle one baby's crying, disrupting his conference calls. 5? The man who'd complained when she'd rearranged his study to make room for a hypothetical nursery? "We'll figure it out," she lied. But even as she said it, Isabella felt something shifting inside her. Not just the impossible new life growing in her womb, but something in her own spirit. For the first time in months, she felt powerful, important, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Richard's phone rang as she was driving home. His name flashed on her dashboard screen. "Hey," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "How did the appointment go?" "Please tell me Martinez has some answers this time." Isabella pulled into their driveway, looking up at the house they'd built together, all glass and steel, beautiful and cold, just like their marriage had become. "Richard, we need to talk. Are you coming home tonight?" A pause. In the background, she could hear music, laughter, Karina's laugh. "Actually, I'm going to be tied up late. Big meeting tomorrow. Can it wait?" Isabella closed her eyes, one hand still pressed to her stomach, where 5 impossible miracles were just beginning their journey. "Yes," she whispered. "It can wait." But as she hung up, Isabella realized she wasn't sure she could. What do you think Isabella should do with this life-changing news? Share your thoughts below. Would you tell your spouse immediately, or would you wait? The next morning arrived with the kind of cruel brightness that makes devastating news feel even more surreal. Isabella sat at their marble kitchen island, still in her silk pajamas, staring at the ultrasound photos Dr. Martinez had given her. 5 tiny shadows, barely visible, but undeniably there. She'd been awake all night, her mind spinning between joy and terror. 5 babies. Richard had wanted 1 heir. How would he react to 5? Part of her imagined his face lighting up, imagined him sweeping her into his arms, imagined them transforming their cold house into a warm home filled with laughter and chaos. The other part of her remembered the way he'd flinched last month when their neighbor's baby had cried during a dinner party. Richard's key turned in the front door at 7:43 a.m. Isabella quickly slipped the ultrasound photos under a magazine, her heart hammering as his footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair mussed. The scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to him like evidence. "You're up early," he said, not meeting her eyes as he moved toward the coffee maker. "I never went to sleep." Isabella studied his profile, the sharp jawline she'd once loved to trace with her fingers, now rigid with guilt he thought he was hiding. "Richard, sit down, please." Something in her tone made him turn. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she'd married, vulnerable, almost young. Then his businessman's mask slipped back into place. "Isabella, before you say anything, I need to tell you something." The words hit her like ice water. She knew that tone. She'd heard it in boardrooms when he was about to deliver bad news to investors. Clinical, removed, final. "I've been thinking about us," he continued, pouring coffee with steady hands. "About our marriage. About what we both need to be happy." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "Richard, let me finish." He sat across from her, the kitchen island suddenly feeling like a courtroom bench. "We've grown apart, we both know it. We want different things. You want domesticity, quiet, and I need more." The ultrasound photos seemed to burn against her palm, where she'd hidden them. 5 heartbeats. 5 reasons why this conversation was about to become impossibly complicated. "More what?" she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. "I've met someone." The words hung in the air like smoke. Isabella felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but something deeper, something fundamental about who she thought she was, who she thought they were together. "Her name is Karina. She makes me feel alive again, like I did when I was building the company, when everything was possible." He reached across the island, his fingers barely grazing hers. "You're a good woman. You deserve someone who can give you what you need, but I can't be that person anymore." Isabella stared at their joined hands. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of being his partner, his supporter, his soft place to land after every business battle. And now when she finally had news that could change everything, news that could give him the legacy he'd always wanted, he was walking away. "How long?" Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. 6 months. "But Isabella, it's not about her. It's about us. We've been more like roommates than spouses for years." Roommates. The word hit harder than she'd expected, because wasn't that exactly what they'd become? Polite strangers sharing a beautiful, empty house. "I've already spoken to Mitchell about the divorce proceedings," Richard continued, naming their lawyer. "With the prenup, it'll be straightforward. You'll be more than comfortable. The house in Napa, the condo in Aspen, and enough to live well. We can be civilized about this." Civilized. as if 20 years of marriage could be dissolved with the same efficiency he used to close business deals. Isabella pulled her hands away from his, the ultrasound photos crinkling slightly under the magazine. 5 babies who would never know their father wanted to leave before he even knew they existed. When? She asked. I'd like to move out this week. Karina and we're planning to get married. Soon. I know that sounds fast, but when you know, right? The irony was devastating. He was talking about knowing, about certainty, while she sat there carrying the most certain thing in the world. New life, their DNA intertwined, growing stronger every moment. Isabella stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Through the kitchen window, she could see their neighbor watering her garden, ordinary life continuing while hers imploded. The fertility appointment yesterday, she said quietly. You asked how it went. Richard's face shifted, remembering. Right. Well, I guess that's one less thing to worry about now. Fresh starts for both of us. The casual dismissal of their years of trying, of her body's perceived failure, of dreams they'd shared, it hit her like a physical blow. But underneath the pain, something else was growing, something fierce and protective. Yes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Fresh starts. Richard nodded, relief visible in his shoulders. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I was worried that it would be difficult. Isabella almost laughed. Difficult. He had no idea what difficult looked like, but he was about to learn. I'll pack some things and stay at the club for now, he continued, already mentally moving on. We can work out the details through Mitchell. Of course. Isabella watched him stand, watched him straighten his tie, watched him prepare to walk out of their marriage with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything else. Richard? He paused at the kitchen doorway. I hope she makes you happy, Isabella said. And despite everything, she meant it, because she was beginning to realize that his happiness was no longer her responsibility. His happiness never had been. After he left, Isabella sat alone in their pristine kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had defined too much of their marriage. She pulled out the ultrasound photos, studying the grainy images of her children. Her children now. 5 little fighters, already surviving against impossible odds. Just like their mother was about to learn to do. How do you think Isabella should handle raising quintuplets alone? What would you do in her situation? Let us know in the comments below. The first thing Isabella did after Richard left was throw up. Not from morning sickness, though that would come later, but from the sheer overwhelming reality of what her life had just become. She gripped the marble countertop of their guest bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, fragile, abandoned. But as she splashed cold water on her face, something hardened in her expression. She wasn't just Isabella Morrison anymore, the dutiful wife who'd spent 20 years making Richard's life easier. She was about to become something else entirely, a mother to 5 children, alone. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up. I hope she makes you happy, Isabella said. And despite everything, she meant it, because she was beginning to realize that his happiness was no longer her responsibility. His happiness never had been. After he left, Isabella sat alone in their pristine kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had defined too much of their marriage. She pulled out the ultrasound photos, studying the grainy images of her children. Her children now. 5 little fighters, already surviving against impossible odds, just like their mother was about to learn to do. How do you think Isabella should handle raising quintuplets alone? What would you do in her situation? Let us know in the comments below. The first thing Isabella did after Richard left was throw up. Not from morning sickness, though that would come later, but from the sheer overwhelming reality of what her life had just become. She gripped the marble countertop of their guest bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, fragile, abandoned. But as she splashed cold water on her face, something hardened in her expression. She wasn't just Isabella Morrison anymore, the dutiful wife who'd spent 20 years making Richard's life easier. She was about to become something else entirely, a mother to 5 children, alone. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up. "I hope she makes you happy," Isabella said. And despite everything, she meant it, because she was beginning to realize that his happiness was no longer her responsibility. His happiness never had been. After he left, Isabella sat alone in their pristine kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had defined too much of their marriage. She pulled out the ultrasound photos, studying the grainy images of her children. Her children now. 5 little fighters, already surviving against impossible odds, just like their mother was about to learn to do. How do you think Isabella should handle raising quintuplets alone? What would you do in her situation? Let us know in the comments below. The first thing Isabella did after Richard left was throw up, not from morning sickness, though that would come later, but from the sheer overwhelming reality of what her life had just become. She gripped the marble countertop of their guest bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, fragile, abandoned. But as she splashed cold water on her face, something hardened in her expression. She wasn't just Isabella Morrison anymore, the dutiful wife who'd spent 20 years making Richard's life easier. She was about to become something else entirely, a mother to 5 children, alone. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up. Dr. Martinez's eyebrows shot up. "Isabella, that's a decision with significant legal and ethical implications." "He left me," Isabella interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "He made it very clear that he doesn't want the complications of family life. These babies deserve better than a father who sees them as inconveniences." Meanwhile, across town, Richard was discovering that freedom wasn't quite as liberating as he'd imagined. Karina's penthouse apartment was everything his marriage to Isabella hadn't been. Vibrant, unpredictable, alive with music and laughter and friends who dropped by at all hours. But it was also chaotic in ways that grated against his need for control. "Baby, you're so tense," Karina purred, massaging his shoulders as he tried to work at her kitchen table, which was covered with wedding magazines and fabric samples. "This is supposed to be exciting time, no? Planning our future?" Richard forced a smile. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months away. Karina had insisted on a spring ceremony, said she wanted to be a May bride, like something out of a fairy tale. The speed of it all made his head spin, but her enthusiasm was infectious, or had been, until the reality of merging their lives began to set in. "I know, sweetheart, it's just, there are so many details. The prenup alone is taking weeks to negotiate." Karina's hand stilled on his shoulders. "Prenup? Richard, we talked about this. I don't want your money. I want your heart." It was the kind of romantic declaration that had swept him off his feet 6 months ago. Now, with his lawyer's warnings ringing in his ears about protecting his assets, it felt naive. "It's just paperwork, Karina. Standard procedure for someone in my position." "Your position?" Her voice cooled. "You mean rich man marrying poor island girl?" "That's not what I meant, but wasn't it?" Richard found himself studying Karina with the same analytical eye he brought to business deals. She was undeniably beautiful, the kind of woman who stopped traffic, who made other men envious. But in the harsh light of morning, without the romance of stolen weekends and secret meetings, he was beginning to notice things. The way she pouted when she didn't get her way. Her habit of ordering the most expensive thing on every menu. The friends who seemed more interested in his credit card than his conversation. "I just want to protect what we're building together," he said carefully. Karina turned away, her silk robe fluttering as she moved to the window. In Jamaica, when people love, they trust. No papers, no lawyers, just heart to heart. The guilt hit him like a punch to the chest. Here was this beautiful, passionate woman who claimed to love him completely, and he was questioning her motives. Maybe Isabella's cautious, analytical approach to everything had rubbed off on him more than he'd realized. "You're right," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm overthinking everything. It's just, this is all happening so fast." "Fast?" Karina pulled back to look at him. "You're the one who said you couldn't wait to start our life together. You're the one who said your marriage was already over and everything but paperwork." She was right, of course. He had said those things. In the heat of passion, In the intoxicating rush of new love, he'd meant them. But now, in the cold light of practical reality, doubts crept in like shadows. "What about children?" he asked suddenly. "We've never really talked about kids." Karina's smile was radiant. "Oh, Richard, yes. I want babies with you. Beautiful babies. I want to give you everything that cold woman never could." That cold woman. Isabella had never been cold exactly. Reserved, maybe. Careful. But she'd also been steady, reliable, supportive. She'd never asked him to choose between her and his work. She'd never made him feel guilty for being practical. "How many children do you want?" he pressed. "2, maybe 3. Not too many. I want to keep my figure, you know." Karina giggled, the sound that had once charmed him now seeming somehow hollow. "And we'll have nannies, of course. I'm not going to change dirty diapers when we can afford help." Richard nodded, but something twisted in his stomach. This wasn't how he'd imagined family life would be. When he and Isabella had talked about children, she'd spoken about being hands-on, about being the kind of mother who knew every detail of her children's lives. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. Isabella's attorney called. "She's not contesting the prenup terms. Wants to finalize everything quickly. Unusual, but it works in your favor." "Who is it?" Karina asked, reading over his shoulder. "Just business," Richard said, but he frowned at the message. Isabella was being surprisingly accommodating about the divorce. Part of him was relieved. He'd expected more of a fight, more emotion, more something. But another part felt oddly deflated. 20 years of marriage and she was letting him go without a single protest? Maybe that proved he was making the right choice. Maybe it proved they'd both just been going through the motions for years. So why did he feel like he was missing something important? What signs do you think Richard is ignoring about his new relationship? Have you ever rushed into something and ignored red flags? Share your experiences below. 2.5 years later, Isabella's life bore no resemblance to the quiet, controlled existence she'd once shared with Richard. The sprawling Napa Valley house she'd received in the divorce settlement had been transformed from a showcase into something warmer, messier, infinitely more alive. At 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, chaos reigned supreme. "Mama, Lily took my dinosaur." "Did not. It's mine. Mine." Isabella Chen-Morrison, she'd kept the hyphenated name, though she wasn't sure why, stood in the kitchen of what had once been Richard's wine tasting room, now converted into a breakfast nook that could accommodate 5 high chairs. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her yoga pants splattered with what she hoped was banana, but could have been any number of substances her 2.5-year-old quintuplets had discovered. "James, Sophia, we share toys in this house," she said with the practiced calm of a mother who'd learned that raising her voice only made everything louder. "Lily, give your brother the dinosaur, and you can have the puzzle instead." 5 identical faces looked up at her. Richard's stubborn chin softened by her own gentle eyes. Her olive complexion blended with his height even at this young age. Lily, Sophia, James, Marcus, and David. Her miracles. Her everything. "Mama tired?" Sophia asked, her small hand patting Isabella's arm with heartbreaking sweetness. Isabella's chest tightened. Was it that obvious? The past 2 years had been a masterclass in survival. High-risk pregnancy followed by premature delivery at 32 weeks. 2 months in the NICU. Sleepless nights that blurred into sleepless days, and the constant juggling act of 5 individual personalities in tiny bodies. But they were healthy. They were hers. And despite the exhaustion that had become her permanent state, she wouldn't trade a single moment. "Mama's okay, sweetheart. Just thinking." What she was thinking about was the wedding invitation that had arrived yesterday, forwarded from her old address by the cleaning service she still paid to maintain the house in the city. Heavy cardstock, elegant script, Richard Morrison and Karina Baptiste request the honor of your presence. She should have thrown it away immediately, should have laughed at the audacity of her ex-husband inviting her to watch him marry the woman he'd left her for. Instead, she'd stared at it for an hour, a crazy idea taking root in her mind, an idea that felt like justice, or revenge, or maybe just the need to show him exactly what he'd walked away from. "Mrs. Morrison?" Isabella turned to find Maria, her live-in nanny, in the doorway. The older woman had been a godsend, experienced with multiples, patient beyond measure, and completely unfazed by the beautiful chaos that defined their daily life. "Your appointment is in an hour. Should I start getting them ready for the park?" Isabella nodded, glancing at the wall calendar covered in color-coded schedules. Pediatrician appointments, speech therapy, mommy and me classes, playground time carefully orchestrated to tire them out for afternoon naps. Every day was a precisely choreographed dance of logistics. "Actually, Maria, could you handle the appointment today? Dr. Peterson just needs to check James's ear infection. I have some business to take care of." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly. In 2 years, Isabella had never missed a medical appointment. "Of course. Everything all right?" Isabella's gaze drifted back to the wedding invitation, now pinned to the refrigerator next to finger paintings and immunization schedules. "I think so. I hope so." Across the state, Richard stood in the bridal suite of the St. Regis Hotel, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco Bay sparkled in the morning sun. In 3 hours, he would marry Karina in a ceremony that had cost more than most people's houses. "You look like you're going to your execution, not your wedding," laughed his best man, Trevor, from the leather chair by the window. Richard forced a smile. "Just nervous. Normal groom jitters." But it wasn't normal nervousness twisting his stomach. It was the growing certainty that he was making a massive mistake. The past 6 months of living with Karina had been educational. The passionate, spontaneous woman who'd swept him off his feet turned out to have some less charming qualities up close. She was demanding, expensive, and possessed of a temper that could turn their penthouse into a war zone over the smallest disagreements. Last week, she'd thrown a crystal vase because he'd suggested they eat in rather than go to the new trendy restaurant she'd read about. The week before, she'd given him the silent treatment for 3 days because he'd had to take a business call during their couple's massage. But it was more than her behavior. It was the way she talked about their future, the trips to Europe, the parties they'd throw, the society events where she could show off her new last name. There was no mention of quiet evenings, of building something together, of the kind of partnership that actually sustained a marriage. "Did you ever wonder if you were settling?" Richard asked Trevor suddenly. "With Michelle?" Trevor considered this. "Every relationship is settling in a way. Nobody's perfect, but I settled for someone who makes me better, not someone who makes me crazy." He paused. "Why? Having second thoughts?" Richard's phone buzzed, a text from Karina. "Where are you? The photographer wants shots of us getting ready together. This is my day, remember?" "No," Richard lied. "Just wedding nerves." But as he headed toward the door, Trevor's words echoed in his mind. "Someone who makes you better, not someone who makes you crazy." Isabella had made him better, hadn't she? She'd been his anchor, his safe harbor, his voice of reason when business deals went sideways or family drama erupted. When had he started seeing stability as boring instead of valuable? The bridal suite was a tornado of white silk, champagne flutes, and bridesmaids fussing over every detail. Karina stood in the center of it all, radiant in a dress that had required 3 fittings and cost more than some cars. "Richard! Finally!" She rushed to him, careful not to disturb her makeup. "What do you think? Do I look like a princess?" She did look beautiful. She always looked beautiful. But as Richard studied her face, he realized he was looking for something that wasn't there. Some spark of the deeper connection he'd once had with Isabella. The way Isabella used to look at him, not like he was a prize to be won, but like he was home. "You look perfect," he said, and meant it. Karina looked exactly like what she was, a beautiful woman playing the role of a bride in the fairy tale she'd constructed around their relationship. The question was, what role was he playing? His phone rang. Unknown number. "Richard Morrison." "Mr. Morrison, this is Claire Watson from the Bay Area Children's Foundation. I'm calling about your ex-wife, Isabella Chen-Morrison." Richard's blood went cold. Had something happened to Isabella? Despite everything, he didn't want her to be hurt. "She's fine," Claire continued quickly, as if reading his thoughts. Actually, she's more than fine. She's been nominated for our Mother of the Year award. The nomination mentions some extraordinary circumstances, raising quintuplets as a single mother while also starting a successful consulting business. I was hoping to get some background from you for our research. The phone slipped in Richard's suddenly sweaty palm. I'm sorry, did you say quintuplets? What do you think went through Richard's mind when he learned about the children? Would you have told him sooner or kept the secret like Isabella did? Let us know your thoughts below. Richard's world tilted on its axis. The bridal suite around him, the champagne, the laughter, the rustle of expensive silk, faded into white noise as one word echoed in his mind. Quintuplets. Mr. Morrison? Are you still there? Claire Watson's voice seemed to come from very far away. Yes, I'm here. Did you say 5 children? Born about 2.5 years ago. Remarkable story, really. Isabella was completely on her own during the pregnancy and delivery. Premature birth, months in the NICU, and she never missed a single day visiting all 5 babies. The nurses still talk about her dedication. Richard sank into the nearest chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. 2.5 years ago, the timing hit him like a physical blow. Isabella would have been pregnant when he left. She'd known about the babies when he'd walked out of their marriage. Mr. Morrison, the foundation is particularly interested in Isabella's story because she's managed to build a successful business while raising the children. Her consulting firm has helped dozens of other single mothers develop financial independence. She's quite remarkable. Remarkable. The woman he'd dismissed as ordinary, predictable, boring, had quietly built an entirely new life, had become a mother to 5 children, had succeeded in ways he was only beginning to understand. I have to go, Richard managed, ending the call with shaking fingers. Darling, you look like you've seen a ghost, Karina said, appearing at his elbow with a concerned frown that didn't quite reach her eyes. What was that about? Richard stared at her, this beautiful woman who'd convinced him he deserved more excitement, more passion, more life. Suddenly her perfection felt hollow, manufactured. Nothing like the quiet strength he was beginning to remember about Isabella. My ex-wife, he said slowly. She has children, 5 children. Karina's laugh was bright and dismissive. Oh, good for her. She always seemed like the motherly type. Very domestic. The way she said it made it sound like a character flaw. They would have been born 2 years ago, Richard continued, his mind racing through the timeline. She would have been pregnant when we divorced. Well, obviously not yours then, Karina said with a wave of her manicured hand. Lucky escape, right? Can you imagine if you'd been tied down with 5 babies? We never would have met. But Richard could do math. He could remember the last time he and Isabella had been intimate, awkward, dutiful encounters that had become increasingly rare as their marriage deteriorated. But still, the possibility existed. The possibility that he'd walked away from his own children. I need some air, he said, pushing past Karina toward the balcony. Richard, the photographer, 5 minutes. Outside, the California sun beat down on him as he pulled up Isabella's social media profiles on his phone, accounts he'd deliberately avoided since the divorce. What he found made his chest tight with something that might have been pride or might have been loss. Photo after photo of Isabella with 5 identical toddlers. Birthday parties where she wore 5 different colored hats to make each child feel special. Beach trips where she juggled 5 sets of swimming gear with the efficiency of a military operation. Halloween costumes she'd clearly made by hand. 5 tiny superheroes or 5 little animals, always coordinated but individualized. But it was Isabella herself who shocked him most. The woman in these photos bore only a passing resemblance to the wife he'd left behind. This Isabella was vibrant, confident, glowing with purpose. Her smile was genuine in a way he hadn't seen in years. She looked happy, truly deeply happy. The captions told the story his imagination had been trying to piece together. James took his first steps today. 4 down, 1 to go. In Quint life. To blessed. Client meeting went so well today that I'm celebrating with ice cream for breakfast with my crew. Success tastes sweeter when you share it. Comme un mompreneur, you're living my best life. 2 years ago, I thought my world was ending. Today, I know it was just beginning. These 5 faces are my everything. Single mom doing it, so now grateful. 2 years ago, right around the time he'd left her for Karina, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator, a man he'd hired years ago for business purposes, but who occasionally handled personal matters. Got the info you requested about Isabella Chen-Morrison? Interesting file. Call me. Richard had forgotten he'd asked Marcus to look into Isabella's finances months ago, worried she might try to contest the divorce settlement. Now, with his hands shaking, he dialed. Marcus? What did you find? Well, first off, your ex-wife is doing better than fine financially. Her consulting business is pulling in serious money. She's got corporate clients paying premium rates for her expertise in efficiency systems. Word is, she's got a waiting list. Richard frowned. Isabella had never shown interest in business before. She'd been content to support his career, to handle the social obligations that came with being a tech executive's wife. But here's the interesting part, Marcus continued. She had quintuplets about 2.5 years ago. 5 kids born premature, spent months in the hospital. Medical bills were astronomical. She had insurance, Richard said automatically. Yeah, but not enough for what those kids needed. Specialized care, multiple surgeries, experimental treatments. We're talking millions in medical debt. Richard's stomach dropped. How did she manage it? That's where it gets interesting. She sold something big enough to cover everything and then some. But the transaction was sealed, private sale. Couldn't track down what it was. But Richard knew. He knew exactly what Isabella had sold. His chest tightened as he remembered the painting that had hung in their bedroom. A Monet water lily piece that Isabella had inherited from her grandmother. She'd always said it was the only thing of real value her family had ever owned. He tried to get her to sell it during their marriage, invest the money more wisely. She'd refused, said it was too precious to price. Apparently, her children had been more precious. Boss? You still there? Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Send me the full report. Richard ended the call and stared out at the bay, his wedding day suddenly feeling like the wrong day to be getting married. Isabella hadn't just survived his abandonment. She'd thrived. She'd built a business, raised 5 children, created a life that looked fuller and richer than anything he'd found with Karina. And she'd done it all while he was playing house with a woman who threw tantrums when restaurants ran out of her preferred champagne. Richard, Karina's voice carried from inside the suite. The minister wants to do the rehearsal in 20 minutes. Stop hiding and come be my groom. Her groom, as if he were an accessory to her fairy tale rather than a partner in building a real life. Richard looked down at his phone one more time, at a photo Isabella had posted just yesterday. She was reading to all 5 children, their small bodies curled around her like puppies, their faces rapt with attention. The caption read, Sunday story time. These are the moments that matter most. For the first time in 3 years, Richard wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, and in just a few hours he was about to make it permanent. Do you think Richard is beginning to realize what he lost? How would you feel if you discovered your ex had children you never knew about? Share your thoughts below. Isabella stood in her walk-in closet, staring at the black dress she'd chosen for today's mission. It wasn't widow's weeds, nothing so dramatic. Instead, it was power dressed in silk, the kind of outfit that whispered rather than shouted, that commanded attention through sheer elegance rather than flash. Behind her, 5 voices created their usual symphony of controlled chaos. Mama, why fancy dress? Sophia asked, tugging on Isabella's yoga pants with sticky fingers. Mama going party, James added, his eyes wide with the curiosity that made him the questioner of the group. Isabella knelt down to their level, her heart squeezing as 5 identical faces looked up at her with complete trust. How did you explain to 2.5-year-old children that Mommy was about to confront the father they'd never met at his wedding to another woman? Mama has some grown-up business to take care of today, she said carefully. Maria's going to take you to the playground, and when I get back, we'll have ice cream for dinner. Deal? Ice cream, they chorused, the promise enough to distract them from her unusual attire. Maria appeared in the doorway, taking in Isabella's appearance with knowing eyes. You sure about this, mija? Isabella had confided in Maria about the wedding invitation, about the decision she'd wrestled with for weeks. The older woman had listened without judgment, but her concern was evident. "No," Isabella admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The truth was, Isabella had spent 2 years building a life so full, so purposeful, that Richard's existence had faded to a distant memory. She'd grieved the marriage, yes, but more than that, she'd discovered who she was without him. The woman who could manage 5 toddlers and a business call simultaneously. The woman who could negotiate million-dollar consulting contracts while making dinosaur-shaped sandwiches. The woman who'd learned that the deepest love wasn't romantic. It was the fierce, transformative love of motherhood. But the wedding invitation had stirred something in her. Not jealousy exactly, not heartbreak, something closer to completion. Richard had walked away from their marriage believing he was trading up, moving on to something better. He deserved to see exactly what he left behind, and their children deserved to exist in their father's awareness, even if they never had a relationship with him. "The car should be here in 10 minutes, Isabella said, checking her reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the defeated wife Richard had left behind. This woman was toned from chasing toddlers, confident from building her own success, radiant with the kind of contentment that came from knowing exactly where she belonged. "Mama beautiful," Lily said solemnly, wrapping her small arms around Isabella's legs. "Thank you, baby girl." Isabella scooped her up, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and graham crackers. "You know Mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky, right?" "More than ice cream?" David piped up, which was their highest measure of affection. "Even more than ice cream." The limousine arrived precisely on schedule, a sleek black vehicle that looked like it belonged to someone important. Isabella had debated the transportation choice for days. Her practical minivan would have been less dramatic, but drama was exactly what today required. Richard understood grand gestures, power moves, the language of status and success. Today she would speak his language. "You got this," Maria said, hugging her goodbye while the children waved from the window. As the limo pulled away from the house, Isabella felt a strange calm settle over her. She wasn't the wronged wife seeking revenge, though there was an element of justice in what she was about to do. She wasn't the desperate ex trying to win her husband back. That ship had sailed long ago, taking her romantic illusions with it. She was a mother protecting her children's future, ensuring they would never have to wonder why their father didn't want them. Today, Richard would learn that his children existed, that they were remarkable and loved and thriving without him. And then she would return to her real life, complete in the knowledge that she'd done everything she could to give her children the truth about their origins. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Cathedral, the wedding of the year was beginning to unfold. Richard stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. The cathedral was filled with San Francisco's elite, tech moguls, society figures, politicians who'd benefited from his campaign contributions over the years. Everyone who was anyone had come to witness his marriage to the stunning Jamaican model who'd captured the city's most eligible bachelor. The irony wasn't lost on him that his first wedding to Isabella had been a small affair, just family and close friends in the garden of her parents' home. Simple, heartfelt, focused on the commitment rather than the spectacle. This felt like a performance. "You doing okay?" Trevor whispered from beside him. The irony wasn't lost on him that his first wedding to Isabella had been a small affair, just family and close friends in the garden of her parents' home. Simple, heartfelt, focused on the commitment rather than the spectacle. This felt like a performance. "You doing okay?" Trevor whispered from beside him. Richard nodded, though his collar felt like it was strangling him. Since the phone call about Isabella's children, his children, he'd been moving through the wedding preparations like a man underwater. Everything felt distant, surreal, wrong. Karina had been radiant all morning, posing for photographer after photographer, directing the bridesmaids like a movie director, orchestrating a scene. She was in her element, the center of attention she'd always craved. But watching her, Richard had found himself remembering Isabella's approach to their wedding, quietly efficient, focused on the meaning rather than the show, making sure everyone felt included rather than impressed. The organ began the processional march, and Richard straightened automatically. This was it. In 15 minutes, he would be married to Karina, committed to a life with a woman who threw tantrums over reservation conflicts and saw his wealth as her playground. A woman who would never sacrifice her grandmother's priceless painting to save children who needed her. The bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle. Friends of Karina's from her modeling days, all legs and practiced smiles. They were followed by Karina's niece, a flower girl who scattered rose petals with the concentration of a surgeon. And then the music swelled, and Karina appeared at the back of the cathedral. She was, objectively, breathtaking. The dress was a confection of silk and crystals that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her veil trailed behind her like a royal train. She moved with the practiced grace of someone comfortable being watched, being admired, being envied. But as Richard watched his bride approach, all he could think about was Isabella's social media photos. Isabella looking exhausted but glowing as she fed 5 babies. Isabella laughing as flour exploded in her kitchen during some ambitious baking project. Isabella asleep in a rocking chair, a child curled against her chest, both of them peaceful in a way that spoke of deep, unshakable love. Karina reached the altar, her smile brilliant behind her veil. She handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and turned to face Richard, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Richard and Karina in holy matrimony." Richard tried to focus on the words, on the moment, on the woman standing before him. But his mind kept drifting to 5 children he'd never met. Children who carried his DNA, his stubborn chin, his tendency toward determination. Children who were being raised by a woman who'd proven herself stronger and more capable than he'd ever imagined. The minister was saying something about love and commitment, about the sacred bonds of marriage. But all Richard could hear was the echo of that phone call. "She's quite remarkable." Isabella had always been remarkable. He'd just been too blind to see it. What do you think is going through Richard's mind as he stands at the altar? Can a person truly change what they want in the middle of their wedding ceremony? Let us know your thoughts below. Do you, Richard Morrison, take Karina Baptiste to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? The words hung in the cathedral air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Richard stared into Karina's expectant face, her eyes bright with anticipation behind her veil. 500 guests waited in perfect silence for his response. The response that would seal his fate, lock him into a future he was increasingly certain he didn't want. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "Richard?" the minister prompted gently. "I dot." Richard's voice cracked. The weight of realization was crushing him. In less than 24 hours, he'd learned that Isabella, the woman he'd abandoned for being too ordinary, had given birth to his quintuplets, built a thriving business, and transformed herself into someone extraordinary. While he'd been playing house with a woman who cared more about Instagram photos than genuine connection. "Baby," Karina whispered, her smile faltering slightly. "Say yes, baby." Richard looked out at the congregation, at faces waiting for the fairy tale to conclude properly. In the third pew, his mother sat with her new husband, both of them nodding encouragingly. In the back, Karina's friends held up phones, ready to capture the moment for social media. A performance, all of it was just a performance. "I need," Richard began, but his words were cut off by a disturbance at the back of the cathedral. The massive oak doors swung open with a sound that echoed through the vaulted space like thunder. Sunlight streamed in, momentarily blinding everyone as a figure appeared silhouetted in the doorway. Isabella. She stood there for a heartbeat, elegant and composed in a black dress that spoke of confidence rather than mourning. Her dark hair was swept into a sophisticated chignon, her posture straight and proud. She looked like exactly what she was, a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, a woman who had built a remarkable life from the ashes of abandonment. But it was what came after her that made the entire congregation gasp. 5 identical children, dressed in coordinated outfits that somehow managed to be both formal and playful. 5 little faces with Richard's stubborn chin and Isabella's gentle eyes. 5 living, breathing reminders of everything he'd walked away from. The children moved with the controlled chaos of toddlers who'd been coached but couldn't quite contain their natural exuberance. James, Richard somehow knew it was James, pointed at the stained glass windows with wonder. Sophia tugged on Isabella's dress, whispering something that made Isabella smile. Lily, David, and Marcus clustered close to their mother, overwhelmed by the grandeur but trusting her completely. "Holy shit," someone whispered from the congregation, and the curse echoed in the sacred space like a prayer. Karina's bouquet hit the marble floor with a sound like breaking promises. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Richard, what is this?" But Richard couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the children, his children, who were looking around the cathedral with the wide-eyed wonder of tiny explorers in a new world. Isabella began walking down the aisle with unhurried grace, her children forming a small parade around her. She didn't look at Richard, didn't acknowledge the gasps and whispers that followed in her wake. She moved like a queen returning to claim her throne, certain of her right to be there. "Excuse me," Karina's voice rose to near hysteria. "Excuse me, this is a private ceremony. You can't just—" "Actually," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral without being raised, "I can." She stopped about 10 feet from the altar, close enough for Richard to see that her eyes held no anger, no hurt, just a quiet determination that was somehow more devastating than rage would have been. "These are your children, Richard," she continued conversationally as if announcing the weather. "James, Sophia, Lily, David, and Marcus Morrison. Born 2.5 years ago, about 7 months after you left our marriage." The cathedral erupted in whispers, gasps, the rustle of expensive fabric as 500 necks craned to get a better look. Camera phones appeared like flowers blooming in spring, capturing every moment of the spectacle. "I thought you should meet them," Isabella continued, her hand resting protectively on Sophia's head. "Before you started your new family." "This is insane," Karina shrieked, her perfect composure cracking like expensive veneer. "Richard, tell her to leave. Tell them to leave. This is our day." But Richard was staring at James, who had broken away from the group and was now examining the altar steps with scientific curiosity. The little boy looked up and caught Richard's eye, tilting his head with an expression that was so familiar it made Richard's chest ache. It was the same expression Richard made when he was puzzling through a complex problem. "Hi," James said solemnly, his small voice carrying in the hushed cathedral. "Are you getting married?" The innocence of the question, the matter-of-fact way the child addressed the father he'd never known, broke something fundamental inside Richard's chest. "I dot." Richard's voice failed him completely. "James, come back here, sweetheart," Isabella called gently, and the little boy obediently returned to her side. But he kept looking at Richard with that curious, analytical expression. "You knew," Karina said suddenly, whirling to face Richard. "You knew about them. That's why you've been acting so strange today. You knew and you didn't tell me." "I found out this morning," Richard managed, "and you were going to marry me anyway." Karina's voice was climbing toward hysteria. "With 5 children you never mentioned?" 5 children with that. Careful, Isabella warned quietly, and something in her tone made Karina stop mid-sentence. "They're listening." And they were. 5 little faces turned toward the woman in white, who was saying harsh things about their mother, their expressions growing confused and worried. "Mama?" Sophia tugged on Isabella's dress. "Lady mad." "She's just surprised, baby girl," Isabella soothed, never taking her eyes off Richard. "Sometimes grown-ups get surprised and forget their manners." The gentle rebuke hit Karina like a slap. "How dare you? This is my wedding, mine. I've planned this for months." "Yes," Isabella agreed calmly. "And now you know exactly who you're marrying. A man who had 5 children and never bothered to find out. A man who walked away from his family because he was bored. A man who values novelty over commitment." She paused, her gaze finally meeting Richard's directly. "I thought that information might be relevant to your decision." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. Richard felt every eye in the cathedral on him, felt the weight of judgment from 500 witnesses to his character, or lack thereof. But it was the disappointment in his children's faces that destroyed him. They didn't understand the adult drama unfolding around them, but they could sense the tension, the anger, the way the beautiful lady in white was saying mean things about their mama. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to Karina, to Isabella, or to the children who deserved so much better than the father they'd been given. "Sorry?" Karina's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Sorry? You've humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You've ruined everything." "No," Isabella said quietly, gathering her children closer to her like a shield of living proof. "He ruined everything 3 years ago. Today he just has to live with the consequences." And with that, she turned and began walking back down the aisle, her children following like ducklings, leaving behind a shattered groom, a hysterical bride, and the wreckage of a fairy tale that had never been real to begin with. How do you think Richard should handle this moment? What would you do if you were confronted with children you never knew existed at your own wedding? Share your thoughts below. The cathedral had descended into chaos. Guests were on their feet, voices rising in shocked whispers and barely contained excitement. Camera phones captured every angle of the disaster. The abandoned bride in her crystal-adorned gown, the groom frozen at the altar, the mystery children who had just blown apart San Francisco's wedding of the year. But Richard heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the sight of Isabella's retreating figure and the 5 small people walking beside her, people who shared his DNA, his stubborn chin, his tendency to analyze everything with serious concentration. People he had never held, never comforted, never tucked into bed. "Richard!" Karina's voice cut through his paralysis like a knife. "Are you just going to let her walk away? Are you going to let her destroy our wedding?" Richard turned to look at his bride, this woman he'd been about to promise his life to. Her face was flushed with fury and humiliation, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her cheeks. She was beautiful, yes, but in this moment of crisis, all he could see was the selfishness underneath the surface. 5 children had just been revealed as his own, and her only concern was how it affected her special day. "Our wedding," Richard repeated slowly, tasting the words. "Karina, I have 5 children." "So what?" she snapped. "You're divorced. Lots of men have children from previous marriages. We'll hire nannies, send them to boarding school, whatever it takes." The casual dismissal of his children's importance hit Richard like a physical blow. These weren't obstacles to be managed or problems to be solved. They were human beings. They were his legacy, his blood, his chance at the kind of love he'd been searching for in all the wrong places. "Richard Morrison, you will not ruin this for me," Karina continued, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed off the cathedral walls. "I've waited too long, planned too much. Those children don't change anything between us." But they changed everything. In the span of 10 minutes, Richard's entire understanding of his life had shifted. The woman he'd thought was ordinary had proven extraordinary. The children he'd never known existed were walking away from him, perhaps forever. And the woman he'd been about to marry was showing him exactly how shallow her love really was. "Minister," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through Karina's tirade. "Yes, my son. I need a moment. I can't do this right now." "Richard!" Karina grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. "You're making a mistake. She's manipulating you. Can't you see what she's doing?" Richard looked toward the cathedral doors, where Isabella was helping the children into the waiting limousine. James had turned back one last time, his small face serious as he waved goodbye to the father he'd just met, the father who was letting him walk away. "I have to go," Richard said, pulling free of Karina's grip. "If you leave this altar, if you walk away from me now, I will never forgive you." Karina's voice echoed through the cathedral. "I will make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." Richard paused at the edge of the altar steps. "What kind of man am I, Karina? The kind who abandons the woman who loves him for some pathetic fantasy about playing daddy?" The words hung in the air like a judgment, but as Richard looked at his bride, really looked at her, he realized she was right about one thing. He was exactly the kind of man who abandoned people. He'd abandoned Isabella when their marriage got difficult. He'd abandoned his children before he even knew they existed. He'd spent 3 years abandoning his own capacity for real love in favor of superficial excitement. The question was, what kind of man did he want to be from this moment forward? "You're right," he said quietly. "I am that kind of man. But maybe I don't have to be anymore." Without another word, Richard stepped down from the altar and began walking toward the cathedral doors. Behind him, Karina's screams of fury mixed with the gasps and whispers of 500 wedding guests. Ahead of him, through the open doors, he could see the limousine preparing to pull away. His children were about to disappear from his life as suddenly as they'd appeared. Richard began to run. His dress shoes slipped on the marble floor, his formal jacket caught on a pew, but he kept moving. He burst through the cathedral doors just as the limousine was pulling away from the curb. "Wait," he shouted, waving his arms. "Please, wait!" The limo slowed, then stopped. The rear window rolled down part way, and Isabella's face appeared. Calm, composed, unsurprised. "What do you want, Richard?" He stood there in his wedding tuxedo, breathing hard, aware that he was probably being photographed by a dozen phones but not caring. I want to know their names, their real names. I want to know if James likes dinosaurs because he was holding one in the cathedral. I want to know which one of them is the artist who drew those pictures I saw in your refrigerator in the photos online." Isabella's expression didn't change. "That's Sophia. She's going to be a painter, I think. Or an architect. She sees the world in shapes and colors. And the others? David loves music. Lily reads everything she can get her hands on. She's already sounding out chapter books. Marcus is the athlete, always climbing, always moving. And James, ... Isabella's voice softened. "James is like you. He takes everything apart to see how it works." Richard's chest tightened. These weren't just generic children. They were individuals with personalities and preferences and dreams. They were people he should have known, should have been there to nurture and guide and love. "Isabella, They don't need you," she interrupted gently. "We've built a good life, a complete life. They're happy and healthy and loved." "But I need them," Richard said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I need them. And I think maybe I needed you too. I was just too stupid to realize it." For the first time since she'd appeared in the cathedral, Isabella's composure cracked slightly. "Richard, you made your choice 3 years ago. You can't just..." "I made the wrong choice," he said urgently. "I can see that now. I thought I wanted excitement, adventure, passion, but what I really wanted was this. A family. Love that matters. Love that lasts." Behind him, he could hear the cathedral doors opening, voices spilling out as the wedding guests emerged to witness the aftermath of the disaster. Soon the street would be full of people with cameras and opinions and judgment, but all that mattered was the woman in the limousine window and the 5 faces pressed against the tinted glass behind her. "It's too late for us," Isabella said finally, "but it's not too late for them. If you really want to be their father, their real father, not just a DNA donor, then prove it. Don't make grand gestures. Don't throw money at the problem. Just show up. Be consistent. Be patient. Be the man they deserve." The window began to roll up. "Isabella," Richard called desperately. "How do I do that? How do I show up?" The window paused. Isabella's eyes met his one last time. "You figure it out, Richard. Just like I did." And with that, the limousine pulled away, carrying his children, back to the life they'd built without him. Richard stood alone on the cathedral steps, still in his wedding tuxedo, watching the most important people in his world disappear around a corner. Behind him, chaos. Ahead of him, the hardest work of his life. What do you think Richard's first step should be in trying to become the father his children deserve? How would you rebuild a relationship with children who don't know you? Let us know your thoughts below. 6 months later, Richard Morrison sat on a playground bench in Napa Valley, watching 5 toddlers navigate the jungle gym with varying degrees of success and determination. It was Tuesday afternoon, his day, one of 2 days per week when Isabella allowed him supervised visits with the children who were slowly, cautiously, beginning to know him as something more than the man who disrupted their routine. "Daddy, look!" Sophia called from the top of the slide, her dark hair flying in the breeze. I'm flying. Daddy. The word still hit him like a miracle every time one of them said it. It had taken 3 months of consistent visits, of showing up exactly when he said he would, of learning that James preferred his sandwiches cut into triangles, and that Lily needed exactly 3 bedtime stories before she'd consent to sleep. I see you, sweetheart, Richard called back, his throat tight with the familiar rush of love that still caught him off guard. You're the best flyer in the whole park. Isabella sat on the other end of the bench, maintaining the careful distance they'd established. She was civil, even kind, but the walls she'd built around her heart remained firmly in place. Richard understood. Trust, once broken, wasn't rebuilt with grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was rebuilt one day at a time, one kept promise at a time, one moment of putting the children's needs before his own. Marcus, stay where I can see you, Isabella called to their most adventurous child, who was attempting to climb the outside of the play structure. Use the ladder, baby. He gets that from you, Richard said quietly, watching his son navigate the challenge with stubborn determination. The climbing or the stubbornness? Isabella asked with a hint of a smile. Both. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. This had become their routine. Tuesday afternoons at the park, Saturday mornings at the zoo or the children's museum, Richard slowly earning his place in lives that had learned to function perfectly well without him. It hadn't been easy. The first few visits had been disasters. The children had been overwhelmed by his presence, confused by this stranger who claimed to be their father. James had hidden behind Isabella's legs. Lily had refused to speak to him at all. David had cried every time Richard tried to pick him up. But Richard had persisted. He'd read every parenting book he could find, had taken a child development course online, had learned that being a father meant so much more than providing financially. It meant showing up consistently, meant learning each child's unique personality, meant putting their emotional needs before his own comfort. It meant becoming the kind of man who deserved to be called daddy. I got the papers, Isabella said suddenly, breaking the peaceful quiet. Richard's stomach clenched. The custody agreement, joint custody, supervised visits transitioning to unsupervised over the next year, child support payments that are frankly more generous than necessary. Isabella glanced at him sideways. Your lawyer is very thorough. I wanted to make sure you and the kids were protected, Richard said, legally and financially, no matter what happens between us. It was true. The divorce from Karina had been swift and brutal. She tried to take him for everything she could, claiming emotional damages and breach of promise. But Richard's legal team had been prepared, and in the end, she'd walked away with a settlement that was generous but not devastating. More importantly, Richard had restructured his entire financial life around his newfound responsibilities. College funds for 5 children, a trust that would ensure Isabella never had to worry about money again, medical insurance that covered every possible contingency. Richard, Isabella said carefully, why are you doing this? Really, you could have just sent money, arranged for minimal visitation, kept your distance, and your guilt-free conscience. Richard watched James help Lily down from the monkey bars, his small face serious with concentration as he guided his sister to safety. Because they deserve better than a father who writes checks from a distance. Because I want to know who they become, want to be part of shaping who they grow into. He paused. Because I love them. More than I ever thought possible. And, Richard met Isabella's eyes, and because I'm hoping that someday, if I work hard enough at becoming the man I should have been from the beginning, you might forgive me. Not for my sake, but for theirs. So they can have a family that works, even if it doesn't look traditional. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, watching their children play together with the easy affection of siblings who'd never known a moment when they weren't the center of someone's world. I forgave you months ago, she said finally, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger was exhausting. And because, she hesitated, then continued more quietly, because watching you with them, seeing how hard you're trying to become the father they need, it reminds me of the man I fell in love with 23 years ago. Richard's heart stopped. Isabella, I'm not saying we can fix what broke between us, she said quickly. Too much has happened. We're different people now. But maybe we can build something new, something better, for them. Before Richard could respond, Sophia came running over, her face flushed with excitement. Daddy, Mama, look what I found. She held out her small hand, revealing a perfect four-leaf clover. That's very special, sweetheart, Isabella said, examining the tiny treasure. What do you think it means? Sophia considered this with the seriousness that marked all of Isabella's children. It means we're lucky, she announced. Lucky to have each other. Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her. This perfect little person who carried half his DNA and all of Isabella's grace. This child who'd grown for 9 months inside the woman he'd abandoned, who'd fought for life in a NICU while he'd been playing house with someone else, who was now offering him the gift of her innocent love despite everything he'd done wrong. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We are incredibly lucky. As the afternoon sun began to set, the Morrison family, complicated, fractured, but slowly healing, packed up their things and prepared to leave the playground. The children chattered about dinner plans and bedtime stories, their voices a symphony of contentment. Isabella fell into step beside Richard as they walked toward the parking area where both their cars waited. Richard, she said quietly, there's something else we need to discuss. His heart clenched, afraid she was about to take back everything they'd built. What is it? Isabella stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. The children have been asking questions about why we don't all live in the same house, about why other kids' parents are married but theirs aren't. What do you tell them? The truth, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that doesn't mean they love their children any less. Isabella took a deep breath. But I've been thinking that maybe we should consider what would be best for them. Not what's easiest for our pride or our fear, but what would actually give them the most stable, loving environment. Richard's pulse quickened. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we should explore the possibility of… Isabella paused, choosing her words carefully. Of being a family again. Not the same family we were before. That's impossible. But a new kind of family, built on who we are now, who we've become through all of this. Richard stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Isabella, are you sure? After everything I put you through, I'm sure that our children deserve parents who work together, who respect each other, who can build something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken. Isabella's eyes were bright with possibility. I'm sure that the man standing here today isn't the same man who walked away 3 years ago. And I'm sure that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way to something even better than what we had before. As if summoned by their conversation, 5 voices called out in unison. Mama, Daddy, come on! Richard and Isabella looked toward their children, then at each other. 23 years ago, they'd promised to love each other for better or worse. They'd failed that promise once, but perhaps failure wasn't the end of the story. Perhaps it was just the beginning of learning how to love better. So, Richard said, extending his hand to Isabella, shall we go home? Isabella looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then smiled. The first truly radiant smile he'd seen from her since before their marriage fell apart. Yes, she said, taking his hand. Let's go home. And as they walked toward their children, toward their complicated, imperfect, miraculous second chance at love, Richard realized that sometimes the greatest adventures weren't about seeking something new and exciting. Sometimes they were about discovering that what you already had was extraordinary. You just had to become worthy of it. What did you think of Isabella and Richard's journey back to each other? Do you believe people can truly change and rebuild what was broken? Share your thoughts about second chances in love and family below. We'd love to hear your story.